If you had a bunch of lights and you were taking pictures or shooting video, how should you arrange those lights? Today we're going to talk about practical lighting. That is, we're going to use some Blender. See right here, this is Blender to explore different aspects of lighting from a practical, if you're using it to light things standpoint. We're going to talk about a brief overview of different types of photographs, such as portrait and landscape. And we're going to go over formats. What is the difference between a lossy and lossless digital format of something like audio or video or a picture? So here we go. This is the second part of our video series on photography and video editing. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Lit Media Workshop. Okay, so we are talking now about practical lighting. Practical lighting is basically how you would set up a scene in order to set things up, right? So let's talk about some of the common places you might find a light and what kind of light it actually creates. Then we're going to reel it in and try to reproduce some of those things in this tool called Blender, which is a 3D modeling application for making things like videos. So the number one source of light in our galaxy, our solar system, is the sun. And the sun is just a single point because it's so far away. And so by the time it gets to Earth, we might have a sun that looks like this, and we might have an Earth that looks like that. The sun is actually emitting light in all directions, but the only ones that actually get to us are basically all going in the same direction. Now, this is a little bit complicated because there's also an atmosphere, and the atmosphere might color the light differently. So, for example, if from your perspective, you're sitting right here, you might see the red part of the light. It kind of has to do with like a rainbow and refraction and things that we've sort of talked about that we're not really going to get into. Practically, if you have the sun and there's no clouds, it's basically a harsh point light. What does that mean? Well, that means it creates lots and lots of shadows. So it's very, very harsh lighting. You get basically an exact kind of copy depending on how high you are. So for example, if you had a plane sitting down below and you had a little ball right here, then you could approximate what the shadow would look like basically there. And that would be in the direction of the sun's lights. Now, if you have a very cloudy day, such as an overcast day, then it's very soft light. Why is it very soft? Well, because by the time the light has gone through this atmosphere, instead of creating a tiny point, it might look something more like this, where you have a plane, and then the shadow is just like this sort of amorphous thing that you might not even see, because the light hitting the ball is actually coming from all kinds of different directions at the same time. And so you get this kind of vague direction in terms of where the light is. And this is a really important thing called a diffuser. And you can make your own diffuser by using things like thin sheets of muslin or some kind of like cloudy looking plastic. And you'll notice these in lighting. In fact, a lampshade is designed to take the light that used to be just a single point light from a light bulb and turn it into something that is much softer, because as the light travels, if you have a light bulb, and the light tries to escape, it basically has to go through like these really tiny holes, and it kind of bounces around a little bit and then creates sort of a soft-ish looking light, which is more pleasant. I like pleasant lighting. So we have the sun. Next we have a camera flash. So if you have a phone or you have a camera that has a flash on it, like a little light will pop up and just blink at a particular moment. So I'll pull up a photograph that's indicative of a camera flash. Okay, so here's a good example from this website, which I will link in the comments here. On the left, they took a picture, and on the right, they took a picture of the same subject in the same environment. But on the left here, they have a camera flash on. Now, what the camera flash does is it lights up the subject. If you're close to the person, it will light them up, just like it's lit this person here. but it fails to capture some of the things in the background. Now, this is a nighttime photo, and in the second photo, they took a very long time-lapse photo with a shutter speed of 15 seconds. Of course, that means that the light was available for 15 seconds. It kind of seems like a more fun, a better picture, but the problem is, can you really get somebody to sit down for 15 seconds? Not typically. So that's kind of what a flash photography thing will do for you. You usually don't use it during the daytime. Usually you use it something like indoors, where you need that extra light to actually light the subject and where you don't mind some of the harsh shadows. Now, if we were to zoom in a little bit on this person in this photo, well, in this case, there's quite a bit of JPEG artifacts right here, and we'll talk about that in the latter part of this today. But you'll notice there's some harsh shadows here. Like there's some harsh shadows on her arm here because it's sitting where the light can't really get to behind it where you typically expect it to get to. Likewise, you can see the shadow forming right here, which is a very harsh shadow, basically from the light from the camera hitting this part of the bench and then casting a shadow beneath it. So if you're using a camera flash, remember you probably want to use it inside, and it's going to create some harsh lighting and some shadows. So you really have to be able to get right in front of the subject that you're trying to take, and you probably need to be within about maybe 10 feet of that subject to be able to cast light on them. Now, if you have a more complicated setup, you can actually create a lot of different effects with specialized lighting and camera equipment, which I'm not going to get into in this class. So we're going to get a little bit Jungian here for a minute. We're going to talk about shadows, and shadows aren't really good or bad in the case of taking photographs or shooting pictures, but they do set a mood. And it depends exactly on what type of picture you're actually trying to take, whether or not you want those shadows. But you want to be aware of how lighting works. And so let's remember a couple of things about shadows, right? So shadows, I would say they can show detail or they can hide detail. So you can cast a shadow on something intentionally, blocking it from out of the view of the camera or something in order to take away that effect somewhat. Also, remember that light is bouncy. So for example, if you have a strong light source shining on something right here, it's going to bounce off of a wall and come back down here. It's going to be basically perpendicular to the normal. And so you've seen, if you can just imagine it like a ball bouncing, you're going to get pretty close. And again, it can bounce on something like the floor, and it can move up. And so this can have some kind of unintended consequences if you don't know what you're doing in terms of lighting and in terms of shadows. And then again, let's remember that there's diffuse or soft light, and there's harsh or direct light. And it's very important to know which of these things you're going to use, and sometimes you're actually using a combination of these things as well. So I guess we'll get started right away inside of Blender, and then see what we discussed there. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about orthographic versus perspective. On the left right here, we have an orthographic view, and I can flip this view around in different axes, and I'm going to go from the top, which is a Z view, and then over here I have a separate window of basically the same thing, and I can change my camera and look around at what the lighting is going to do. Right here I have a small light, and if I click on this light, I can adjust things like how bright it is, what color it is, and things that we will look at some point here. For now, let's just talk about the view here. In an orthographic view, no matter how far the camera is away, everything is going to be the same proportion. So things that are on top are on top, things that are on bottom are on bottom. The depth, that is how far away something is from me, the viewer, does not impact its size. Whereas in the perspective, let's actually change this view for a second. For example, if we take a look at this block right here, up here, you'll note that there's only appears to be a single square. Whereas over here, if I look up from above, it's also only a single square. But as soon as I switch to rendering, so these are both orthographic views, and you know that because if the square on top and the square on bottom are the same size, then there's no change in the depth. So over here, this is now perspective, where we see these lines. So this is perspective over here, and that's actually over here too, but the issue is that there's just this top face that we can see. If we go to a different perspective, then it's more clear that we're in just a regular sort of perspective camera versus orthographic. And I'll show you that difference here too. So this is a regular perspective camera right here, but I can change it to orthographic, and then it looks like this, kind of like a StarCraft game or something, like Age of Empires or whatever kind of a game that you've been playing. And this is a much more useful kind of a view if you're doing something like building something or doing graphics or looking at a blueprint, because you can measure a line like this line right here and this line right here, and they'll be the same size. Whereas if we switch back to our perspective view, this line is going to be, I think, longer than this line or vice versa. But, it's like art, 1-point perspective, that kind of thing. So I'm going to switch this view back, and then let's talk about light a little bit. Okay. So in this scene, I also have a light. And as soon as I find my light, there's my light. I can change where this light goes, and so I'm going to try to match up both of the views somewhat. So, and I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller so that we have more space to deal with here. Okay, so over here, we have this, which corresponds to that. And we also have this little standard monkey head thing. So I can move these things into the scene, and they change and they render. Now, if you put these things side by side and you look at them, you'll notice something, right? You'll notice that this light is straight on with the bust right here, with Nefertiti's head, and it's kind of to the side with a monkey head. Now, I can make this even more pronounced by adjusting where this light is. If I move it back, then the shadows move back behind. And if I move it far enough back, it will look like almost Nefertiti doesn't even have a shadow. But you'll notice something else. What is that? It's that everything is kind of dark now. There's not really enough light. So I'm going to move it back forward to them, and I'm just going to get right up next to her face. And you'll notice at this point, it looks like maybe the light is kind of giving her like raccoon eyes. So if we take a little look around here, we'll notice it's because that light is actually very high. So we can also lower where that light is and put it essentially just right in front of her face is what we're going to try to do, right in front of her nose. And now I would say things look overblown. It's as if there's too much light going into the camera. And there's a couple of ways that I can adjust this. I can change the power on the camera. Should we try that? Let's try that. So I'm going to reduce the power. Right now it's 1,000. And I can just take it down to, let's say, 100 watts instead. And if I do that, this is how the lighting looks. Now, I won't say that this lighting is particularly good because it seems like it's actually overblowing some of these features. So I can't actually tell what's going on. And this kind of portrait lighting photography thing, it's been around for a while. And also note that this monkey head, it actually is made up of lots of flat shapes. Whereas this Nefertiti model, if we go on very close, you will see that it's actually very complex geometry and it's relatively smooth. So that's something to take into account here. And I won't really have time to go over it very closely, but if you're really interested in something like portrait photography or setting up like a nice studio to do streaming in, there's something called 3-point lighting. Let's take a look at that, and we're going to try to recreate it here inside of Blender. I'm not promising I'm going to do a great job. Okay, so here's an article on 3-point lighting, and I've looked at some of these tutorials before here. But essentially, what you want to do is you want to have a typical 3-point lighting setup. And in that setup, there's a backlight that's a little bit less powered than most things. There is a key light. This is the light that has the most energy, the most power, and is directional. And then there's a fill light. This fill light is designed to hit some of those smaller shadows. Now, this assumes that you're basically in a studio, but if you're not in a studio and you're outside, you can actually do some creative things like using a big blanket to bounce harsh sunlight from one direction on your object and then create kind of like a pretend fill light that's just a bounce light from a big blanket or a bouncing light device that you can get fairly cheaply. So this is showing an overhead view, and it's assuming that you have an object here. This could be like a piece of fruit. It could be like an actual person or whatever, but it's basically assuming one object, and light can get very, very, very complicated. So we're gonna keep it basic today. So I'm gonna try to recreate this in Blender, and I guess we'll do some of it together, and some of it we'll do apart. Okay. So first thing, I am just going to rearrange this a little bit. So for now, I'm just going to get rid of this little monkey head. And for now, I'm actually going to move this bust on top of this stand right here. Just like that. So we'll pretend it's kind of standing up there. And then I have to refine my light, which I guess is right here. And I'm going to change what kind of light I actually have. So instead of just being a regular light, I'm going to move, I'm going to go in some of these settings. I'm going to use something called an area light. This gives it some direction. It's not exactly, I don't know how true it is to reality, but I'm going to go ahead and just do it. So first, I'm just going to actually point this light towards the subject or the object, as it were. Maybe participant would be a better word. Then I'm going to go back into my overhead view, and I'm going to point it just like our figure has here. So, okay. So we have a key light kind of bottom and to the left. We have a fill light bottom and to the right. And then from the back, we have a backlight. So I'm just going to make 3 of the same lights for now. And I'm going to point them all at the subject. Maybe I will move that down a little bit. And I'm going to move the camera here basically to accommodate for that. Not what I wanted. There we go, closer. So we can do pretty much straight on. Then I'm going to turn this back up to 1,000, which is what we started with. I think that looks better. It's probably too hot, too big, so I'm going to go ahead and go to 600 here. And then I'm going to copy it and paste it. I'm going to move it to the other side here. This is going to be my fill light. I'm going to rotate it again towards the subject. And then I'm going to reduce the power to something like half of that. Finally, let's just take a look at what we have now. So at this point, if we look down at the shadows, we can see the key light has most of the light here, and then the fill light is coming up this way. And we can even kind of see these laser things that are depicting the direction of these lights. Now, I'm going to add a backlight. So I'm going to copy this light. I'm going to paste it. I'm going to move it and rotate it. And basically my thought is I want to sort of come behind here. There we go. So that's the backlight. And the backlight's going to have the least amount of power. So I'm going to say 200. Okay. At this point, I think our power is about correct. And I want you to note some things about about this. But to do that, I feel like I need just a little bit more. So this is how it looks from the side. I like that profile shot, actually. We can see lots of detail here. For example, right there. It's a nice shot, I think. We can see from behind here. This is the way the lighting works, and you'll see that this key light came from this direction, and the other light is not quite as strong. Okay, so this is a decent shot. Now I'm going to move the camera inside of Blender to match kind of where I am. Okay, so in this view, I'm actually changing a camera, and this is kind of the crop of what's actually going to render. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this, and then I'm going to render it with more detail so we can see what's actually going on here. I'm going to get a nice close-up view here of the face, and I'm just going to move down just a bit here. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's render it. Okay, so this is rendering, and this is what it looks like when it's pretty close to done. Actually, it's got tons and tons of samples, which are probably not necessary, but this is kind of what it looks like with the 3 lights. Now let's take a look at just the backlight. Okay, so this is just the key light right here. Then we'll look at just the fill light. Okay, this is just the fill light. You'll notice that it's much darker, that the light is coming from the other direction. Now, let's look at the backlight. Okay, and this is just the backlight. So all of these different lights combine together, and they highlight different aspects of the object itself. And the 3-point lighting is a really good way to go ahead and light up a subject, and especially like a portrait situation, but basically anything. Now, if you want to do that, you'll probably actually need some lights. You'll need a room that doesn't have a ton of light in it already. And that's yeah, that's a little bit about lighting there. Now I want to talk briefly about a couple of other things. One of them is the types of photography, and then we're going to talk about image formats. So if we had a lot more time, I would probably go into a lot of these in some detail, but I want you to be aware of what these are. And essentially, this is just from the Wikipedia article on categories based on photography, right? There's all these different kinds of photography styles. And so this kind of gets into like the same genre as something like literature. So just to continue our conversation on mapping the literary context or the subject audience purpose, all of these are going to change based on what category you're in. So one of them is aerial photography. That's like photographs from airplanes. Astrophotography, that is photographs of space. For this, you're going to want to use something that has a very, very long focal length. Not focal length, a very, very long exposure time, high aperture, at least a long exposure time. And sometimes they'll put a little system that basically turns along with the Earth so that the stars don't create a blur from all of the motion blur from the very long photographies. There's also flash photography. Flash photography is about how you can, take a picture with a flash, just like we were talking about before. There's landscape photography, right? This is like pretty pictures of landscape. For that, you'll want to use a small aperture. You'll want to take the picture in good lighting conditions. Again, good lighting depends on the kind of effect, the kind of mood that you're trying to actually create. There's also underwater photography. Don't put your cameras in the water, probably. There's nature photography. This is like trying to be able to get a picture of something that actually exists. Panorama, that is like taking a picture of a 360-degree view. Scenic photography, stock photography. There used to be something called stock photography, and basically you would predict what people would need in terms of marketing material, and you just take pictures in all of these ways. Should we look at my favorite stock photography? This is my favorite. Harold here. Just a happy person, This very, very famous stock photography. There's monochrome photography. It's like just two colors, mugshots, like from prison. The big ones here are going to be portraits. They're going to be landscapes, and they're going to be like, I don't see one here, but basically still life, something like a nature photo, but for, apples and fruits, kind of like what one of the students showed in class last time. So there's a bunch of different portrait photographers. There's a whole thing here. So there's a way that you could explore some of these, maybe with some parental supervision. And sometimes a portrait photographer, they'll spend a long time with somebody and really just try to get the essence of what that person is by capturing them in a moment that they see as representative of that person. So very, very interesting. For landscape photography, oftentimes, they have a particular kind of a landscape that they're looking for, or a particular kind of a mood that they're looking for. So you can kind of browse through some of these. People of India. We have, I don't really know these people at all. So yeah. This is for later times here. But the point I want you to take across here is that you're probably going to have to use different settings for different kinds of purposes if you're taking photographs or you're shooting video. Okay, now we're going to talk about image formats. So the first one we're going to talk about here is just lossless compression. And I guess we shouldn't even talk about that. First, let's just get to the whiteboard. Okay, so we have lots of different formats that we can save things digitally in. And I think it was in this class, right? For example, if you have an audio file and you look closely at it, it's just going to look like this, some kind of wavy things. And these wavy things are basically encoded in time. So for audio, this would, in a raw format, this would be a WAV file. It'll have like this extension, and it's just a digital file in your computer. And literally, it basically means everything from -1 to +1. And that's the position that it wants your speaker to be in to recreate that sound. It's a very, very simple thing, and it's represented in binary, but essentially it's just representing different degrees of 1 at particular timestamps over time. So for example, if you're doing 44 kilohertz, then there's going to be 44,000 different individual numbers that go up and down over time. That is your raw sound file example. Now, there's also a lossless sound file called FLAC, FLAC, and that is a version of this which basically saves some of the space. So for example, an entire audio CD might be something like 700 megs, but a lossless FLAC might only be 300 megs. By megs, I mean megabytes, which that's just like a unit of measuring how much memory it takes. Think about it like volume or length. Then we have something lossy. Something lossy that's audio is called an MP3 file. How does this work? Well, it's very complicated. But basically, instead of trying to be exactly correct about all of the shapes, the way that MP3 works is it makes lots of little kind of copies of individual shapes. And then it tries to reuse those individual copies, and they take up less space than 44,000 numbers per second, but they can't be exactly put back. If you took a FLAC file, you could convert it to exactly the same WAV file. But if you took an MP3 file, you can't get back to this exact shape. That's what makes it lossy. You're losing information, you're losing fidelity, you're losing sound quality. To most people, maybe something like 256 kbps. That's like a certain rate of memory. I don't remember how much that reduces it by, but let's say that instead of 300 megabytes for a whole album, you're dealing with something more like 80 megabytes. Now, why do you care about how much space something takes? Well, things can get very, very, very big very fast when you're dealing with video in terms of how much space you need for it, especially if it's in a raw format. So let's take a look at another kind of image, another kind of format, right? There's a raw format for an image called BMP or bitmap. Now, this format is essentially the same thing as this. You have, I guess I'll draw it a little bit closer here. For a BMP file, let's just assume that you had something like 9 pixels. So you'd have 3 pixels wide and 3 pixels down. So each one of these would be a pixel, and this pixel would be represented by R, G, and B for red, green, and blue light amounts. Now, a full value, the highest it is on all of these, will give you white. And if you only have them in red, it will only give you red. And so these files can get kind of big because once you have like a whole megapixel, say 1,000 by 1,000 pixels big, well, that raw format is going to be kind of big. And there's even another kind of file called raw. This is a format found in photographs. This has even more information than R, G, and B. I don't know what that information is. It might be R, G, and B, and also just a lot of them. So R, G, and B, each of these only has 256. That's 8 bits, or 8 ones and zeros, ones or zeros. But a raw file, I think, is maybe double that. I can't remember, but it's bigger. So the lossless format, I would say sometimes it's PNG. There are versions of the PNG that are lossless, but you have to set it correctly. The lossy is the JPEG, JPG, or JPEG. Now, the JPEG works basically the same way that an MP3 file works. Instead of thinking of individual pixels, the JPEG file thinks of, let's say it's a 3x3 pixel at the same time. So they kind of get averages of these typical things that you see, and it ends up actually becoming very much like this picture that we were looking at a minute ago, which I'm going to re-bring up now. So this is from the same photo. This is from the same photo shoot, I assume, because it's from the same website. And if we zoom in, I don't know why it's not. Okay, we'll go like this. I don't know what's letting me zoom in here, but you can see here that there's these artifacts here. And these kinds of artifacts, they're actually not ISO artifacts, they're actually JPEG artifacts. And so you can get a JPEG file to be tiny, 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 but it comes at the cost of quality. So, we can talk about video now, but video is basically very similar. You can have, it's tricky though, right? You can have an MP4 file that is lossy. You can have an MP4 file that is lossless. And you can have an MP4 file, which is much more typical, that has some kind of compression in it. And basically, the way that this works, it creates also its own kind of JPEG artifacts. Now, I'll look up some typical space usages from these systems that capture this kind of information. Okay, so a BMP file, for the same file, you might have something like a 15 megabyte image, whereas the PNG, this lossless, might be something like 10 megs, and the JPEG of the same size might only be 2 megs. I don't remember what it is for videos, so I'm going to look that up now, and we'll find out together. So before we do that, let's just take a look at this website for a second. This is the quote-unquote ultimate guide to video formats. And this just shows you how many different formats there actually are. There are video codecs, there are video containers, there is bit rate, and there's bit depth. And so you'll notice that there's a ton of different kinds of video formats. The ones you really need to know about are probably MP4 and MOV. VLC should be able to play any of these video formats. But your bit rate is going to be important. Your bit depth is going to be important. And your video codec, that can be important as well. Most of the time, you probably won't have to worry about this. But if you're dealing with a lot of different formatted videos and frame rates and all of that, well, this is just something that you're going to have to deal with. And so there's codecs, which basically they're like translators. They take a big video and they turn it small, and they take a small video and they put it back in a format that you can actually view. The most common ones are H.264 and H.265. If you see these in your MP4 file export settings, I think you're pretty much golden. That is pretty much what you're going to care about. And I will also say that video encoding and decoding, it can take a lot of time. It can take most of the time of your rendering when you're actually creating these videos. So let's try to find a little bit about the size these things take. Okay, so here's just kind of an example that gives you a flavor. They give you examples of different formats, examples of different resolutions. So this is like 8K is basically this many pixels by that many pixels, etc. 720p is like this. And then you want to have a frame rate that is the same as your video. So 24 to 30 FPS is decently pretty good. And these are the recommendations on the bit rate. This is megabits per second, so it's not quite the same as megabytes per second. It's about maybe 8 times different. But in the end, for even just a 1-minute video, you can have a 24 megabyte file. So it's complicated. It's good to use a little bit of compression, especially if you don't have infinite space. And that's it for this time. So just a summary here, right? We talked about practical lighting, things like harsh versus not harsh lighting, diffused lighting versus non-diffused light. We learned about the 3-point method for lighting up a subject, especially for portrait photography. We learned about different types of photos, including landscapes and portraits. And there's lots of different versions of this: astrophotography, aerial photography. And then we learned about formats, especially the difference between raw, lossless, and lossy formats. So these are the kinds of things that we'll be talking about. Just keep working on your fake commercial video projects, and we will see you in class.